that we will now recess for two purposes. First, to hear Joe Sobran, who has graciously agreed to schedule his speech at whatever time we happen to get done, followed by a lunch break. We will be reconvening here at 3 o'clock for the vice presidential nominations. Couple of schedules changes. Dick Futrell will speak at 2 p.m. in the conference theater, not 4 p.m., and John Buttrick will speak at 3 p.m., not noon. To introduce Mr. a reminder, there is a possibility, a distinct possibility, that there will be a little bit of time to take up a couple of platform items between the time of the vice presidential nominations and the acceptance speech. You should bring your copies of the platform report with you just in case. With that, to introduce Mr. Sobran, one of a growing commodity in the Libertarian Party, and one that will be growing even more in this election and the elections to come, one of our highest-ranking elected Libertarians from California, City Council, our Mayor, Bonnie Flickinger.
Thank you. What a wonderful time to be a Libertarian. When I first discovered the Libertarian Party a long time ago, Libertarian conventions were very special events for me. They always generated a very emotional high because Libertarian conventions were the only escape I had from a world of burdensome and stifling regulations and ever-increasing taxation. Only at Libertarian Party conventions could I spend 3 full days with people who loved freedom as much as I did. And only at Libertarian Party conventions could I find the hope and the promise of a freer world. That was 20 years ago. Today, Libertarian Party conventions still represent the hope and the promise of a freer world, and they still are an escape from a burdensome statist society. But today's Libertarian Party conventions are not the only encouragement that freedom lovers have. Today, the Libertarian message has invaded that statist society and is changing it. Today, there are genuine Libertarian victories to celebrate. Yesterday, I shared with some of you a few of our Libertarian advances at the level of municipal government. In many ways, my city is more Libertarian than it was before I was elected. Moreno Valley today has fewer regulations, a smaller, less costly government operation, and much lower taxes. And my story is only one of many. Today, there are almost 200 Libertarians in public office who are making a difference at the level of local government. This afternoon, however, we examine the other end of the governmental landscape, the level at which non-Libertarian officials use the power of the federal government to impose their political will on others. The level of government which has not yet heard the Libertarian message. Our guest speaker brings with him extensive experience in critiquing American foreign policy and informing the world of its shortcomings. For 21 years, Joseph Sobran wrote for National Review magazine and served as its senior editor. He has been a commentator for CBS Spectrum series and a widely syndicated columnist for both the Los Angeles Times and the Universal Press. He is the author of the book called Single Issues, Essays on the Crucial Social Questions, and he publishes a monthly newsletter which bears his name. Today, Mr. Joseph Sobran will speak to us on Pax Americana, not what the founders intended. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Libertarian Party National Convention and to introduce to you Mr. Joseph Sobran.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today. If this isn't a great year for a third party, there'll never be one. And we have an especially appealing candidate in Harry Browne, who always reminds me of Gene McCarthy, one of my first political loves, who actually managed to raise the tone of American political discussion for at least a week back in 1968. And I hope Harry can do it again, maybe even a little longer. After Boris Yeltsin's victory in Russia's runoff election the other day, President Clinton effusively congratulated the Russian people on having made the right choice. He said, "The Russian people have turned their backs on tyranny. They are turning the corner towards freedom. They and their leaders have cleared another important hurdle in building a new and enduring democracy." These words struck me as a bit of a pat on the head, more than a trifle condescending to the Russians. I wondered how Americans would feel about a foreign ruler telling them after an election that they'd chosen the right man. Not that there'd often be occasion for it. But just try to imagine it. Now, how easily we've come to the assumption that it's our job to play not only a tutelary but an active role in seeing that other countries are governed properly. In World War I, Woodrow Wilson announced the relatively modest war aim of making the world safe for democracy. Now we've adopted the more ambitious aim of making sure the whole world is democratic, from Haiti to Bosnia to Russia. As a matter of fact, Russia's already surpassed us in one of the essential features of democracy. That is, it has a thriving multi-party system. For some reason, the American establishment assumes that two parties are plenty. In fact, that anything more than two parties is wretched excess. So we get this effective choice between two parties that accuse each other of wanting to reduce entitlement programs or of shirking America's duty to provide global leadership. Reminds me of Bill Buckley's quip some years ago that a debate between two candidates, two then current candidates, would be like a debate between the Smith brothers on cough drops. You know, wow, some choice. And after every meaningless election, we have to endure these lectures on our low voter turnout. Never seems to occur to all the semi-official talking heads here in Washington that the reason other democracies get higher turnouts is that their voters have more choices. If two giant corporations controlled an industry the way our two major parties control our political system, using the law to keep smaller competitors out of the market, would we call that a model of market competition? I somehow doubt it. The 92 Perot vote showed that the American people are ready for real political choice. Perot wound up with 19% of the ballots cast. If he hadn't angered so many of his followers by dropping out of the election and acting flaky in the middle, he might have gotten twice as many. He might have become president. At one time, opinion polls did show him to be running way ahead of well, let's say he was ahead of Bush, and Clinton was third with 20%. At one point, I thought the Democrats were going to be the third party. Nobody really knew what Perot stood for, but that just underscores how deeply Americans hate the two choices they usually get. But it makes me wonder, should Russia pressure the U.S. to adopt genuine multi-party democracy? I wish Boris Yeltsin would at least encourage our young president to move toward a market economy. This year, Americans will be asked to choose between Bill Clinton and Bob Dole, between the morally disqualified and the intellectually disabled. But such stark personal differences shouldn't blind us to what these two candidates have in common. They both offer the same qualification for the nation's highest office. Neither poses the slightest threat to the status quo. Both what the media call moderates. It's worth pausing to just to define our political labels a little bit. If you favor federal intervention at home, you're a liberal. If you favor federal intervention abroad, you're a conservative. If you favor both, you're a moderate. And if you favor neither, you're an extremist. Well, by these definitions, America used to be a land of extremists. It was dedicated to a philosophy of limited federal government at home and neutrality abroad. The founders and framers were emphatic on both points. Presidents used to feel obliged to assure the nation in campaign speeches and inaugural addresses that they'd respect the limits on federal power at home and refrain from getting us into war overseas. Gradually, the meaning of the Constitution was not only forgotten, but actually inverted. Just as the general welfare was expanded to give the federal government powers the Constitution never conferred, and therefore denied, the common defense of the United States has been expanded to mean not the defense of our shores against invaders, what a quaint idea, but global hegemony. To resist our alleged responsibility of global leadership, as they call it, is to commit the sin of isolationism. On the one hand, we're assured that our national interest requires these ubiquitous interventions, but if, after weighing costs and benefits, you argue that it's not in our interest at all, you're scolded for being isolationist. So it turns out that intervention is not really our interest, but our duty. We're constantly reminded of the lesson of Munich, that aggressors have to be stopped early. We never hear of what might be called the lesson of Sarajevo, that alliances among governments may plunge a whole world into war over a single incident. Over the last 2 centuries, the U.S. armed forces have killed millions of people in their own countries, while foreign armed forces have killed only a handful of Americans on American territory. Is it realistic to say that this ratio reflects only American defense, with no element of aggression or even needless intervention? A few weeks ago, I noticed a striking illustration of the new mindset. The magazine The Weekly Standard, which considers Bill Clinton insufficiently interventionist, ran a cover story with the legend, "Is this any way to run a planet?" Run a planet. Gee, I remembered how often our official propaganda has accused the Kaiser and the Nazis and the Japanese and the communists of seeking world conquest. Before the Gulf War, one overheated conservative pundit even called Saddam Hussein a global menace. And let's not forget the menace of, yes, Manuel Noriega. Now it appears that running the whole planet is an American prerogative. Another pundit has said within the space of a couple of years that the U.S. is threatened by Iran, and then he said North Korea, and then China. Is there any country that doesn't threaten us? And it isn't just foreign governments we have to worry about. We're also facing the amorphous threat of terrorism, which requires us to give the government new anti-terrorist powers to abridge our freedoms, since any one of us could be a terrorist, especially those who talk about the 10th Amendment. I read that in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. It said one of the marks of these terrorist groups was a kind of an obsession with the 10th Amendment. So frisk me. Well, what it comes to is there's no place on earth where we don't have to defend ourselves. And when we aren't defending ourselves from some hypothetical direct physical attack, we're defending our vital interests in this or that region. Our interests, as you may have noticed, become vital on very short notice. The common denominator of all these threats, dangers, and crises is that they require an increase in the power of our government, which means primarily an increase in its power over us, including new exemptions from our knowledge, criticism, and control. Defense always includes secrecy in the name of national security, and secrecy by definition means building new walls between the government and the people. Obviously, our government can't keep secrets from foreign enemies unless it also keeps them from us. So any alleged foreign threat becomes an occasion for reducing our own traditional freedoms. By this logic, we must finally destroy democracy in order to save it. Now, what I've described may sound like a cunning design to deprive us of our freedoms, but in fact, there is no great design, and whatever cunning is involved is of a very low order. We recently got a vivid glimpse behind the scenes of the sort of people who actually whittle away at our freedoms when we took a gander at the sort of men who've been illicitly handling confidential FBI files. And I don't have a lot of faith in whoever's handling those files illicitly either. Lord Acton said that all power tends to corrupt. That's true, but there's an even more basic truth, which is that all power tends to accumulate. Power is a dynamic thing. It's extremely hard to control. Those who have it tend to want and get more of it. This is a blind instinct. Bill Clinton, Bob Dole, and for that matter, Craig Livingstone don't have any discernible philosophies. But put a little particle of power in front of them and they'll go for it the way a hen pecks at a grain of seed. Now, the U.S. may have been conceived in liberty, but it didn't stop there. Nobody in 1776 could have foreseen the possibility of an American global empire, because nobody could imagine the telegraph, let alone computers and jet engines, nuclear weapons, and the other myriad forms of technological progress that would give political power whole new dimensions. The men who went to Philadelphia by horse and boat in 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation didn't plan a world empire. They couldn't have imagined it. Most of them were wary even of domestic centralization. Their generation was haunted by the danger of what it called consolidation, the breaking down and assimilation of smaller units of government by larger ones. We no longer consider consolidation a danger. In fact, we consider it so normal that we no longer even use the word. Since the 19th century, the educated classes of the West have generally taken it as an article of faith that centralized power is as progressive, as surely an improvement in the human condition, as electric power. A 20th century statesman said, "It goes without saying that only a planned economy can make full use of a nation's resources." That was Adolf Hitler. But it might as easily have been Joseph Stalin or Franklin Roosevelt or any number of intellectuals. Our problem is not that so many intellectuals have believed in the centralized state, it's that men like Clinton and Dole just take it for granted. Neither of them has the slightest interest in returning to the system the framers of the Constitution designed. True, Mr. Dole carries a copy of the 10th Amendment in his pocket, but he apparently hasn't found time to read it through. He takes pride in having helped the Democrats pass any number of federal laws and programs that fly in the face of the 10th Amendment. He doesn't even know there's a contradiction. As far as the two major parties are concerned, the Constitution isn't on the ballot this year. It hasn't been for a long time. Now, I don't mean to make an idol of the Constitution, you understand. I think Lysander Spooner's argument against its legitimacy is very hard to answer. But it is the idol of our government. Our rulers vow to uphold it, and they stake their own legitimacy on it. Spooner said it was a contract on which he was unable to find his own signature. But our rulers, at any rate, have signed it. It's certainly their contract, and they should be held to it. That would be a big improvement, and one we ought not to despise. In theory, we, the people, wrote the Constitution to tell our rulers what they could and couldn't do. It conferred powers, but it also set limits. Seemed like a good idea at the time. So what happened? Our rulers decided that it was their privilege to decide what the Constitution meant. They gradually gave their own judiciary the sole authority to decide what their powers were. And guess what? The Supreme Court has made a habit of ruling in their favor. It's decided that the Commerce Clause gives them countless powers mentioned nowhere else in the Constitution. It's decided that the 14th Amendment strips states and localities of powers they'd always taken for granted. And it's declared that the 10th Amendment is no more than a truism. The truism, according to the court in the 1940 ruling, is that, quote, all is retained which has not been surrendered. Interesting choice of words. The court didn't say that powers had been delegated to the federal government. It said they'd been surrendered. Now, what's delegated can be revoked. It's conditional. A delegate is the servant of those who make the delegation. But what's surrendered is gone forever, and the word implies the superiority of a conqueror. The court was implying that the federal government had conquered the American people, its nominal masters, which is pretty much the case. Every dispute over the federal government's constitutional powers is now decided by the federal government itself. And the American people, though they don't exactly like this arrangement, are largely unable to detect a fallacy in it. In a recent TV interview, Judge Robert Bork suggested, not for the first time, that the 10th Amendment is dead and gone. He said, in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the framers listed the powers of Congress, which were somewhat general but definite enough. And in the 10th Amendment, they said they really meant it, that powers not granted remained with the states or with the people. That was a system that began to break down almost at once. Judge Bork added, I think the idea of enumerated powers through which the federal government is limited is an unrealistic idea and never had a chance of working. The 10th Amendment and the enumeration of the federal powers have become passé. The federal government has assumed plenary power, and it is too late to turn back. Now, I respect Judge Bork's judgment on this. It deserves to be taken seriously as a pragmatic judgment. Because if he's right, the anti-federalists were right when they said it would be a mistake to ratify the Constitution. As you may recall, the anti-federalist argument was not so much that the Constitution granted too many powers to the federal government, but that there would be no way to confine it to its enumerated powers once it existed. There'd be no effective barrier to the usurpation of powers that weren't granted. The 10th Amendment was supposed to reassure the wary public by emphasizing that all powers not delegated to the federal government were retained by the people and the states. And it did help, but in the long run, the constitutional restraints broke down. The U.S. not only joined the worldwide movement toward centralized government, it became an empire into the bargain. The same dual development under the slogans of socialism, unification, fascism, communism, and so forth was occurring in England, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Russia, which soon became major players in the most gigantic wars in all world history. Internal consolidation and imperialism go naturally together. They may be hypothetically separable, but in practice they seem to abet each other and feed on each other. When Soviet communism collapsed, liberals hoped that America's Cold War swords could be beaten into socialist plowshares. What they didn't understand was that the welfare state owed much of its legitimacy in the minds of Americans to the belief that the government was defending us from foreign threats. Many conservatives subordinated their opposition to socialist programs to the overriding purpose of defeating the Soviet Union. As long as they saw the federal government as a global savior, they were willing to put up with its domestic excesses. If the U.S. military establishment were ever reduced to the scale required for genuine defense, as in defending our shores against invaders, in the absence of a plausible foreign threat, the American people might demand similar reductions in the welfare state. Already we see that many Americans who recently seemed super patriotic have come to regard their own government as their chief enemy, like a mean watchdog that's no longer needed to protect the house and keeps biting the kids. Now that we know the KGB isn't going to get us, we're looking a little differently at the IRS. So the establishment can be expected to keep finding uses for the military. The legitimacy of the post-constitutional regime, which came into its own with Franklin Roosevelt, depends on the myth that it saved us from foreign monsters, Japanese, German, and Russian. So the search for new monsters, Serbians, Iranians, terrorists, will go on. Otherwise, the ordinary tax-paying American might start asking himself what good this government does for him in return for the $10,000 or so it annually extorts from him. Gandhi was once asked his opinion of Western civilization. He said, "I think it would be a wonderful idea." That's what I think of constitutional government. It'd be a wonderful idea. It would confine the federal government to a handful of specific powers, few and defined, as James Madison put it. Am I out? Oh, boy. All right. I was just saying that if we had real constitutional government, it would confine the federal government to a handful of specific powers, which would be, as Madison put it, few and defined, and forbid it to raise armed forces except for defense. Madison also assured his readers that the powers remaining with the states would be numerous and indefinite. But wouldn't that permit tyranny at the state and local levels? Yes, it would. In fact, in many respects, it did. But here's where I think we come to a blind spot among many libertarians. It's better to have state and local than federal tyranny. There is never going to be a perfect government, or with all due respect to you anarchists out there, a perfect absence of government. Power is always going to exist, and it's always going to be abused. The best we can hope for is to confine it to small territories, make power compete with power. The more options people have, the less any government can afford to oppress them. If they can If they can flee to a relatively free neighboring state, as black people used to flee slavery and segregation, and as businesses still flee local taxes, it's at least hard for the local government to grow very much. That's why collectivists typically want not only centralization, but territorial expansion. It's why communist countries arm their borders not against invaders, but against would-be immigrants. It's why Hillary Clinton wants national health care, not state or county health care. The freedom to migrate is precious, but it's devalued when governments form cartels that make it pointless to leave one place in search of a better one. So you can think of the 10th Amendment as an antitrust act for government. So how then did the federal government wind up with a monopoly? Well, it's a long story, but it couldn't have happened without the supine acquiescence of most Americans who've been content to let their rulers define their own powers. And so the carefully wrought Constitution, whose checks and balances, enumerated powers, and Bill of Rights were supposed to limit the federal government, has been incredibly turned into a crude carte blanche for federal power. Maybe Judge Bork is right. Maybe we can't restore the 10th Amendment. If so, constitutional government itself is a lost cause. But I don't think we can afford to give up just yet. After all, even a tyranny has to make some show of legitimacy. And at the very least, we can keep reminding people that this government isn't playing by its own rules. Thank you very much.